to the lagoon and the beach. And so she's been able to get a very practical, hands-on understanding and relate that to the reports that she's been consistently getting. I think today's milestone is in accordance with the commitments we made at the Redham building, at the Redham school meeting, and broadly would cover the issues of the air pollution, the estuarine pollution, the ocean pollution, the public health issues, and then the regulatory framework and the investigations that have been underway and some of the decisions that have been taken. Of course, the report will also reflect the multidisciplinary nature of the work and to that extent the complexities from a scientific point of view, and will even indicate that international experts have to be brought to bear to assist us to navigate the way forward. Also at a government level, it's a very, very strong intergovernmental framework effort. There's about 8 departments that are involved, all of whom have their separate legal jurisdictions and responsibilities. And I think we can say that we are working in a very, very cooperative way. So the report will talk to the containment measures, the mitigation measures, and then of course what is going to be very much a work in progress for some time to come is what we call the remediation measures. That does not take away the issues about the regulatory compliance issues and what consequences flow from that. I think a matter which is of considerable public interest from a more immediate purpose are the beach closures and the impact it has on our tourism. We will cover that, and just let me say, without taking away from the report that's going to be delivered, that we are very keen to restore the beaches as quickly as possible, but we have to be responsible about it. Yes, there has been a report which will be presented, which made a recommendation, but from the very beginning we had said that we would possibly want a peer review of any report that's presented, and that peer review is currently underway, and the inputs will talk to the detail of that. So too around the health screening processes, and as far as the public health issues are concerned. So unfortunately I have to leave to catch this flight, but the Minister is going to be able to deal with the detail, and the expert teams are here from all 3 levels of government. So I hope that you will pardon me that I have to leave in a few minutes' time. Thank you for listening, and Program Director, back to you.
Thank you, MEC. We'll take inputs from Minister, who will read a statement shared with yourselves, and then we'll also get presentations to just give us an illustration of the nature of the challenge and also the work that's been done to date to rehabilitate or to identify areas that were hardly hit. Minister?
Thank you very much, Albie, and let me take this opportunity to welcome my colleague in the provincial sphere of government, the Honourable Ravi Pillay. Let me also acknowledge my colleague in the sphere of local government, Councillor Diane Hoorzoek. And of course, all of you ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this morning as we release the joint preliminary investigation into the compliance profile of UPL South Africa Pty Limited in Cornubia, north of Durban. Now, this report, as you have heard, is the result of an investigation of a multidisciplinary team into the regulatory environment in which the UPL warehouse was required to operate, and the environmental impact of the chemical spill and the fire incident that has caused the most serious environmental catastrophe in recent times. Empirical evidence, ladies and gentlemen, shows that an entire ecosystem, which includes the Umhlanga tributary, the Umhlanga estuary, the beaches, and the coastal environment, not only in the vicinity of UPL, but for several kilometers to the north of the Umhlanga estuary mouth, has been seriously impacted and may take several years to recover from this incident. In the days following the fire, the air quality in the immediate vicinity was also affected. Beaches along this stretch of the KwaZulu-Natal North Coast remain closed, and subsistence and recreational fishing, as well as the utilization of any marine living resource in the area, remains prohibited. The impact on ecotourism in Umhlanga and the reserve will be felt for a considerable period of time to come. The release of the compliance report today honors a commitment I made in the National Assembly when this matter was debated, that when completed, the findings of the investigation and the recommendations will be made public. The compliance report, which we will share with you in some detail after I have finished speaking, contains a factual assessment of the 7 different government institutions or authorities related to all the licenses, permits, and authorizations that UPL was required to have in order to lawfully conduct its operations at Cornubia, compared with those that UPL held at the time of the fire. It evaluates the legal provisions relating to the duty to eliminate or limit further damage to the environment and the sanctions which such a duty may attract, bearing in mind the liability of those individuals whose actions may have caused and or further contributed to the widespread damage. The findings indicate that UPL was not in possession of the requisite environmental authorization prior to establishing its operations in Cornubia 3 months before the incident. The authorization should have been obtained from the KwaZulu-Natal Department of Economic Development, Tourism, and Environmental Affairs. In addition, UPL had not obtained a critical assessment or planning permissions from the eThekwini Metropolitan Municipality in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the relevant municipal bylaws. Had UPL undertaken this process, in our view, it would in all probability have been defined as a major hazard institution, considering the significant volumes and nature of the chemicals stored in that particular location. These assessments would have determined the emergency readiness of the facility in the face of a disaster such as a fire. When I spoke in the National Assembly, I made it clear that if it is established that UPL operated without the required permissions, the appropriate steps will be initiated. Accordingly, a criminal case was opened in September at the Verulam police station. An independent team of investigators comprising environmental management inspectors from both the national and provincial departments have initiated a criminal investigation. This investigation is being undertaken in line with the Criminal Procedure Act and involves the collection of evidence, including sampling of, amongst others, sand, water, fish, and plants, to determine criminal liability in relation to the harm that has been caused to the environment. The probe will also take into account the liability of other role players that may have been involved in this matter. Of course, at this stage, it is important to say that it is not our role as the environmental authorities to make findings of guilt or innocence. These findings can only be made by a court of law once the National Directorate of Public Prosecutions makes a decision to prosecute this matter. Now, the recommendations are not limited to this particular incident, but they also suggest proactive measures to strengthen the regulation of the sector as a whole. This includes a recommendation for a baseline compliance profile of the entire agrochemical warehousing and manufacturing sector, and the inclusion of this sector into the national environmental compliance and enforcement regime. I will, in the near future, be meeting with my counterpart in the Department of Rural Development and Agriculture to discuss the implications of this recommendation for the sector that she leads. The report also recommends an evaluation of the response of the authorities to the incident, with the aim of enhancing our capabilities to respond to similar incidents in the future. Ideas currently on the table include the establishment of an interdepartmental rapid emergency response team to deal with a certain category of incidents, and the establishment of a panel of intergovernmental experts. Ladies and gentlemen, it's important up front to say to you that the environmental rights enshrined in our Constitution are people-centered. By implication, the response by the authorities in this particular situation was motivated by the need to give effect to this inherent right. Given the scale of the incident and the numerous regulatory authorities involved, government focused on three priority areas. First and foremost was to ensure that further environmental and health risks were contained. Secondly was to oversee and guide the assessment, cleanup, and remediation process. And thirdly has been to investigate the incident within the ambit of the regulatory environment applicable to such a facility. Yesterday, I spent over 4 hours touring the incident site and being briefed on the extensive cleanup and remediation efforts which are in process. This process is guided by specialists from all 3 levels of government and others employed by UPL itself. This team has worked together to isolate the containment in the tributary and are applying a range of initiatives to contain the problem, including the physical removal of sediments and water from the system. So far, 13,000 tons of contaminated solids and 23.5 million liters of contaminated liquids have been professionally removed from the UPL site and the environment below it. The further studies being undertaken are aimed at guiding an integrated remediation and implementation plan to target all affected environmental media in the longer term. The threat to human health remains an important concern for government. In order to ensure long-term monitoring of the affected communities, particularly in Blackburn village, the authorities requested UPL to place a mobile clinic in the affected communities on a semi-permanent basis and to extend the human health risk assessment to include biological monitoring of the affected community. To ensure that affected communities are fully briefed on developments, we have developed a draft terms of reference to establish a multi-stakeholder forum in line with the recommendations that the Portfolio Committee made during its visit to the site in August. This forum will ensure meaningful engagement between authorities and the public and act as a conduit for the dissemination of information to communities affected by this incident. In conclusion, I'd like to point out that we remain in an emergency situation in this area as a result of the fire and the spill. Accordingly, I will ensure that the National Department continues to provide critical specialist support to the Joint Operations Centre and to my colleagues in provincial and local government. The National Green Scorpions will also continue to lead the criminal investigation that was initiated and work closely with the other entities involved in the investigation. So the danger hasn't yet passed, but in time, with enough remedial work and attention, we hope the environment will recover, and those responsible for this incident directly and indirectly will own up to it and take responsibility for their actions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Minister, for the address. We will now take a presentation from Mr. Grant, Francis will lead us with a presentation. Francis is the Chief Director responsible for enforcement in the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. Francis Craigie. Francis, your turn.
Thank you very much and good afternoon to everybody. I'm going to take you very quickly through specifically the joint preliminary investigation report that the Minister has gone into quite a lot of detail on, just to give you a sense of where it comes from. And I think, firstly, it's quite important to let everybody know it is a preliminary investigation. So when we're doing our enforcement work, we need to do enough work as part of the investigation to enter into a reasonable suspicion that non-compliances have taken place. In order to do that, there's a preliminary investigation that is done, and then what happens at a certain point in time, once we have enough reasonable suspicion, it then kicks over into a criminal investigation. And this report that will be launched today is obviously a result of that preliminary investigation, and it's quite important just to understand that. So my presentation will look at the terms of reference, at the methodology, the way in which we do it, issues we investigated, as well as the key findings and recommendations that are set out in that report. The response plan that the Minister spoke of talked about 3 priorities. And so Grant, after me, will talk about the priorities 1 and 2 and the work that's been happening around that. But the report that I'm specifically speaking about is around priority 3, which is really looking at that regulatory environment in which people were operating. So the terms of reference, and I'm hoping these two are in time with each other, the terms of reference was to really investigate the incident within the ambit of that regulatory environment, to look at the legality issues. Did they have permits? Did they require permits? Did they not have permits? Which permits did they in fact have? accountability for their actions after the fire, looking at the provisions within our legislation to say what potentially are those key provisions that they might have been in non-compliance with, and then to make findings around those issues. So the methodology of the investigation, as the Minister said, it was a factual assessment based on the information we had at that time. Very importantly, within the period July, August, there was information that we as authorities had, and so this preliminary investigation was based on what was readily available in terms of information. Further information as we start the criminal investigation then gets taken in terms of the Criminal Procedure Act, and evidence is collected. But this report was based on the information we had at that time. There was a multi-departmental team of 7 institutions that are responsible for various regulatory functions within the space. You'll see that the Department of Trade and Industry as well as SARS were consulted, but they were not part of that preliminary investigation as we moved forward. So UPL was operating, as I said, in a highly regulated environment before the fire as well as after the fire. And it was important that we gained an understanding of the extent to which their failure to do certain things and to get certain regulatory permissions may have compromised the preparedness of that facility to actually react in the way that it needed to because of the incident. There was technical expertise, there were legal expertise on the team that did the preliminary investigation. Interviews were held, documents were reviewed, and also we evaluated the linkages between initial licenses for the Cornubia development versus what licenses specifically UPL needed for that specific warehouse. So having a look at the issues investigated, we obviously, from the information we had to have a look at what was in that warehouse, the volumes, the types of products. We needed to look at the applicable regulatory framework, the legal obligations that sit within our different pieces of legislation, and then the entities involved. And you'll see from this picture that it's not only UPL, but there were various entities like Tongaat, like Fortress, that were also involved in this issue, and that further investigation needs to happen under the criminal investigation to understand the liability of those entities. So just having a look at this slide, this just gives you a sense of the different types of products from an agricultural perspective. There's obviously, and I'm going to go to the next slide in a minute, where you'll see all the different pieces of legislation, but it's important to understand there were labeling products, there were packaging products, in addition then to different chemicals. And different products had been classified also in different ways. And so you can see the validated products, you can see the number that did not require validation from the Department of Agriculture, as well as certain classifications where further investigation is still required. So this preliminary investigation didn't have completely final findings, but there are certain findings that we could make at that time. So if you have a look at this next slide, you'll get a sense of all the different acts, from the Hazardous Substances Act through to the National Water Act. The Fertilizer, Farm Feeds, Agricultural Remedies and Stock Remedies Act was also applicable, as these were pesticides. The Major Hazard Installation Regulations, which is under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. The EIA regulations under the National Environmental Management Act, as well as what we call NEMPA and NEMBA, which are your Biodiversity Act and your Protected Areas Act. And then in addition to all of those, then you also have the bylaws and the local authority mandate around zoning, around building plans, certificates of occupation and scheduled activity. So you can understand the complexity of this regulatory environment. So the key findings, and I think the Minister has touched on a number of these, so I'll go through them fairly quickly, but UPL's operations then involved the unlawful storage of what we classify as dangerous goods. And it's important to understand that unlawful in the sense that they required certain permissions that they did not have before the fire. So the volumes of chemicals stored in that warehouse was significant, and it therefore triggered what we call, in terms of NEMA and the EIA regulations, a listed activity. And in order to commence with a listed activity, you need to obtain an environmental authorization from the KZN department. And prior to them actually giving you that authorization, you need to undergo what we call an environmental impact assessment. And so they needed to have done that, and that assessment would have then guided the authorities as to whether to issue the authorization or not, and whether to allow that storage of those chemicals to happen in that area, or whether the authorities might have said, not in that area, you can perhaps do it, but in a separate area. But none of that process was undertaken, which would have allowed us to do that. The next issue is around what we call the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the Major Hazard Installation Regulations. And there it appears from our preliminary investigation that they did not undertake that assessment that is required in order to declare them as a major hazard installation. But based on the fact that we understand what the volumes and the types of chemicals are, we had reasonable suspicion to conclude at that point that they were an MHI, and therefore there were certain regulatory provisions that they were then not in compliance with. And linked to that MHI is what the bylaws refer to as a Scheduled Activities Permit, and that had not been obtained by UPL prior to the fire taking place. And that Scheduled Activities Permit would have also taken into consideration the risk assessment that should have been done as part of the MHI process. Finally, in terms of the key findings, we then said that we're looking at all the different issues around local authorities, the building plan for the proposed subdivision of the warehouse. The warehouse was subdivided between UPL and another, let's say, entity at this point. And that use had been, as you can see there, recommended for approval by eThekwini Fire Department. However, that approval was not for occupation. So the approval for occupation would only have been supported after the subdivision was constructed and then deemed compliant. So once, obviously, an inspection had taken place to ensure the fire requirements had been put in place. And so that approval for occupation had not been given. The occupation of the warehouse by these two different tenants had also not been authorized by eThekwini. After the fire, and this is a more tricky environment because obviously within the National Water Act, within the National Environmental Management Act, there are provisions that hold people accountable. And what it says there in those is that where you are unlawful and you are intentional or negligent, then you are in contravention of a duty of care. And so what is important is that it's difficult at the preliminary investigation stage to understand whether there had been that intention or negligence. So we're obviously saying there was unlawfulness and that they didn't have the permits that they required, but we will now do further investigation under the criminal investigation where we can then put forward evidence of potential recklessness, intention potentially, or negligence. Because I think it is important that people realize that, not having those licenses could have impacted in the risk assessments not being done, could have resulted in the failure to comply with those provisions, and therefore created a point source of pollution, which even though the fire wasn't started by UPL or any of the other entities, because of those things that were not in place, we could prove potentially that there may have been negligence. But again, as I said, the preliminary investigation doesn't necessarily find that. We need to do that further investigation under the Criminal Procedure Act. So looking at the recommendations, the independent team of investigators the Minister spoke about, we already obviously started that investigation. Quite a volume of work has been done. Sampling has been done, a number of interviews have been done, there's certain procedures within the Criminal Procedure Act to obtain certain documents and other evidence, and that is underway at the moment. We're looking at the various entities, not only UPL, to understand potential liability on their part. And although the report then really focuses in on this regulatory issue, we do also make a recommendation, as the Minister said, to let's look at our response by the authorities and to evaluate it. And if there were failings, how do we begin to strengthen those? But probably the most important is also what the Minister said is that, the preliminary investigation is not about pronouncement on innocence or guilt. We are now following the criminal procedure. The docket will be handed over to the relevant prosecutor, and ultimately, if there's a decision to prosecute, then it is the court that makes that decision around guilt and innocence. Ongoing recommendations, again, very quickly through them. Baseline compliance profile assessment, you heard the Minister speaking about that. And if necessary, we're then going to take that. We have a number of priority sectors within our compliance and enforcement program that we focus in on. And the thinking is really to look at this agrochemical storage and manufacturing sector as another priority sector for compliance and enforcement work. Looking at the protocols, processes, the communication with regard to the relevant departments, and see how we can streamline those and improve them. Looking at potentially, as Minister said, an interdepartmental rapid emergency response team, and also looking at our provisions and our guidelines around these responses and saying, do we need to amend some of them based on what we've learned through this particular exercise? And then, quite importantly, understanding what is our pool of specialists within South Africa to really assist us in terms of these types of incidents, and have a panel that we can call on to assist us with these types of incidents. And so finally, in terms of the way forward, I've spoken a little bit about that. We are dealing with the criminal investigation as a matter of urgency. However, we are at the same time really important for us to do our work in a way that we collect evidence that is admissible in court and that we don't cut corners. And so we do have to follow a very specific procedure. I've spoken about the compliance profile baseline that we're looking at doing, as well as the incident management procedures. So maybe the final issue just to talk about is we will be looking at engaging with the Environmental Assessment Practitioners Association to look at this issue around the panel of specialists. You know, it's important to eliminate bias, and I know that a lot of people have spoken about the fact that, you know, sometimes it's difficult where the specialists are appointed by the actual company that may have caused some of the harm, but that is in line with the polluter pays principle in our legislation. But at the same time, we need to get that balance to ensure that, you know, there isn't the bias that can potentially creep in. So we're looking into that as well. So I think let me stop there. I know that I think Grant may come in now just to talk more generally about priority 1 and 2 and where we're finding ourselves around responding to the incident.
Thanks, Francis. Grant Walters will lead us with a presentation.
All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the media. I'll be taking you through priority 1 and 2, and the work of that 2 priorities is currently led by the Provincial Environmental Department of KwaZulu-Natal. The chairperson of that forum is my colleague Sabelo Ngobo, so just to recognize you, and we are joined today by a number of technical experts in the field that, you know, will assist me with some of the answers if required. All right. So in terms of, just to introduce where we currently are, sorry, let me just see if, oh right, there we go, is that this current presentation that I'll be delivering will touch on 73 days of work of the government authorities post the fire incident. Ladies and gentlemen, it's important for me to emphasize the point is that we are still in an emergency situation, as the Minister has pointed out. The emergency has not passed, but certain aspects of this emergency has abated quite considerably. So you would recall that initially there was quite a lot of, you know, an element of air quality related matters that has completely dissipated at this point in time, but it's really to focus on what is the response strategy by the authorities in the areas where the plume fell out, and that is currently what we're basically concentrating on. As the Minister has said, the systems in terms of the Olklanga tributary, the freshwater and aquatic systems in close proximity to the UPL building has been severely being impacted. The major impact has been seen in terms of the Mhlanga estuary. which has been severely impacted, and I'll touch very briefly on that impact in this presentation. Members of the media and ladies and gentlemen, it's important to understand that we are dealing with a very complex pollution situation at this point in time. It requires us literally to think on our feet. Adaptive management or implementation is quite at the forefront of the response. The continuous measures to remediate the damage is ongoing, an ongoing exercise at this point. And simultaneously, we are working with a specialist appointed by UPL to deal with, with all of the complex remediation work that needs to be done. And as we've said, there are work commitments that were made to the public, and I'll touch very briefly on those as well. So the incident happened on the 12th and the 13th of July, and basically, obviously, it was an unrest situation. Our ability to respond as a collective authorities, considering that almost 7 different authorities were impacted, was significantly delayed. The effective response really did happen around about on the 22nd of July, and that was when the smoldering pockets were completely doused by the fire department. And we could then get in and completely understand in the particular situation. At that point in time, the contents of the facility or what was in there was not entirely known to us. But that is just a very brief background of the particular incident as it unfolded on the 12th and the 13th of July. So as I've said, the presentation will touch on priority 1, what is those urgent interventions that are being implemented on the ground at this point in time, and what we are doing as authorities to guide that particular actions. And that is all set out in terms of, the mechanisms that we use, and I'll touch briefly on those issues as well. So in terms of urgent interventions, at the spill point, or where it exited the lower end of the UPL site, that area has been changed into a pollution control dam. As the Minister has pointed out, about 13,000 tons of solid waste materials has now been removed from the environment, and approximately 23.5 million litres of liquid is currently being transported from the UPL site to Gauteng, where there's licensed facilities that can deal with this particular product. So that's currently what is happening in terms of urgent remediation. And as you can see, coming up, behind me is just a couple of pictures of what is actively being undertaken on the site. What the thinking at this point in time is to increase the pH of the particular river system, and that will just target the molecular structure of the contaminants at this point in time to break it down. River cleaning, wetland desludging, and removal of the contaminants, and to expose the contaminants to UV treatment. So there's a bigger area that has been excavated to facilitate that particular process. In terms of priority 2, as I've said, is that we quickly had to form a joint operations center, and as I've said, that initiative is being led by the Provincial Environmental Department. It has been divided into about 5 thematic areas, but one of them are being operated in tandem, which is the air quality and environmental health thematic area of work. We've got Estuarine, marine, as well as the coastal, freshwater and groundwater. And then, as Francis has just delivered to you, would be the compliance profile response that we then that we had to initiate. On the health-related front, this was the very first undertakings as government. Estuarine issued the very first directives on this particular area, and that basically then requested from UPL to undertake certain health-related matters. Estuarine Health, as well as the National Department of Health, was then actively engaging with the various retail stores in terms of opening. There were quite considerable amount of health-related education that happened within the Blackburn community just to sensitize the individuals staying in that area in terms of the risk. A mobile clinic was deployed for a full week within that first month. Although there's continuous responses by eThekwini Health, basically on a month, or every single Monday. That clinic is still in that particular area. We did door-to-door surveys, and all of this data is currently being analyzed. So it's a lot of volume of work. It's being analyzed, and it's currently being facilitated and prepared within a reporting a report. So I just want to see if the slides at the back is following me. So in terms of just the way forward on that is that we are looking at deploying clinics on a far more semi-permanent basis. The risk assessment or human health risk assessment report will be due quite soon, and that will allow us to do more targeted intervention in terms of on the health front. On the air quality assessment that was or is being undertaken, we're waiting for the air impact report that is almost finalized and will be submitted to the departments quite soon. There were already, during that fire incident, UPL had commissioned certain air studies that needed to be done, and we've got a compendium of work that was undertaken during that incident. That report is with government at this point in time. So the results of the continuous monitoring exercise is currently there, but it's obviously being inputted into a report to give us far more, definitive direction in terms of the health risk response. All right, so some of the issues that did come up previously in community engagements was, what have we done as the authorities or working in tandem with the UPL specialists at very specific susceptors, and that was at the Redem House. There was swabbing that was being undertaken in that area. The residues on the sugarcane was taken. It is currently being analyzed. It's being incorporated in that human health risk assessment report, which is due to the authorities quite soon. The Blackburn community gardens, and as we've heard this morning, is that there were stoppages just put in place in terms of further cultivation and sale of those produces within the community. We're very alive to the fact that the communities obviously derive a financial benefit in terms of that. So we are working at speed just to understand the impact and then to deal with that particular risk. On the Estuarine and Estuarine coastal and marine aspect, there was the engagement with the authorities did request for a quicker turnaround of time when it comes to the sampling, the independency of the toxicologist that needed to be reviewed and submit further reports, and that would inform then beach opening and closures, updating of method statements to remediate the environment, and then where we are currently is this issue of integration of the findings into a remediation strategy. Let me jump to the Old Klanga Lagoon Nature Reserve, which forms part of that particular system. It is quite important, as the Minister has said, breeding grounds for fish stock, etc. And the thinking here is to reset the system back to its kind of state that it was in prior to the fire incident. So a lot of work is being undertaken there just to understand that and to obviously facilitate the remediation of that particular system. All right, that's just the slide that I did speak about now. In terms of beach closure, to update you on that front, is that the reports were submitted to the authorities. That was on the 24th of September. We have referred initially to the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Dr. Kristen Kittelis had an initial look at the report and provided an interim assessment of the findings contained in that report. It was further then submitted to Professor Weeks, who will be undertaking a further detailed peer review of that study. His appointment was finalized on the 29th of September. I believe that he has already come back with certain requests and that we will be submitting to him in the coming days. And this is a matter that we're obviously moving forward with great amount of speed, just to understand in terms of Umhlanga, the value of the system, ecotourism, holiday seasons, and etc., what we need to currently undertake there. So on the freshwater system, This was obviously an area that was quite heavily impacted. It did relate to then a nuanced kind of standard operating procedures being developed by the team that is currently being implemented. Approval of the work is happening with the government authorities, and as we said, this system has been quite impacted, and a lot of work is currently being done there. All of this work basically translated to a workshop between the UPL specialists and government specialists on the 9th and 10th. It was followed by very intensive in-field assessments on the 13th to the 17th, just to provide additional support, additional advice, and also to understand from a standard of doing reporting to the authorities what we did then expect. So a lot of in-field work has been done by the particular specialist. Decisions that flowed from that particular workshop was then to issue new notices to UPL. We're waiting for the responses. It should reach us by the 6th of October. We have imposed final timeframes or intended final timeframes for the delivery of all the reports. That was set for the 11th of October, so we'll listen to what they say and what the complexities may be to deliver those final reports, but that we've set that intended time frame for the 11th. The remediation plans, that notice specifically talks about draft remediation and implementation strategy. We've set a time frame for the 14th and the 15th of October to review that draft plans, and that needs to be delivered to all the authorities. The human health risk aspect, we have basically requested that it needs to be extended to include biological monitoring of the affected communities, and I'm sure that will be done. That's obviously at the very forefront of this particular response. I put up this slide just to show the MEC's engagement with the communities, and that was very on a face-to-face basis, that there were a number of these authorities. This will now be expanded to include a stakeholders forum, as we've committed to this morning with the public. The terms of reference of that particular forum will be released to the public tomorrow. It will allow for 7 days for comment period, and after which it will be finalized. The Minister and the MEC wants to get moving with that particular stakeholders forum within the next 14 days. It needs to be established in the next 14 days. So just in terms of way forward, the issue that's paramount at this point in time is the beach closures, and to get that peer review from Professor Weeks in the coming days. We are waiting for those representations from UPL. There's ongoing interventions on the ground that is currently taking place. And then, as I've said, is the issue of the multi-stakeholders forum that has to be established in the next 14 days. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is me from just a very brief kind of high-level overview of what is happening on the ground. Thank you very much.
Thanks. That's Mr. Grant Walters. Grant is the director responsible for environmental impact and pollution enforcement. Environmental impact and pollution enforcement in the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. We will be taking questions from the floor. I would like to also invite Francis to form part of the main table here. We will take questions from the floor. You'll indicate your name. Okay, we'll start at the front. We'll start. Okay.
Good morning. Well, good afternoon, Minister. It's good to see you here taking a personal and active role in this issue, which falls squarely within your mandate of environment. But it also has broader dimensions in terms of human health. And my question is not entirely rhetorical in asking, where is the Minister of Health? Where is the provincial minister, MEC for Health? um, be- because so far they both appear to have been completely absent without leave. The departments have not issued any statements, they've not responded to any queries. So I realize that that's perhaps not a question that you can answer directly, but I ask it anyway. The second question relates to the issue of dioxins. These are highly toxic chemical compounds which occur in when chlorine and combustion and pesticides are involved. I'm not a chemist, but certainly there does appear to be a risk of contamination from dioxins, and the Department of Health, the Joint Operations Committee, UPL, have all avoided this question, direct questions on, and I'd like to put it, of all the dozens, maybe hundreds of samples that have been collected over the past few weeks, how many of those have been specifically analyzed for dioxins and furans? It is a very costly process, and I hope there's no skimping or deliberate avoidance of taking those samples. And then if any samples results have been have come through, what are they? The last question, if I may, relates to the independence of the process. You've alluded to it, that there's criticism of the fact that many of the specialist studies have been commissioned by UPL as the polluter, and that that is the process that is followed with under NEMA. But at the same time, given those concerns, and particularly indications that some of the specialists are bound by non-disclosure agreements, to what extent can the independence of the process be improved? Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. We'll go to the next question. Yes.
Yes, hi. My name is Thabiso Koba from The Witness. I think my question might also be directed to Councillor Huzak. Just from what we've heard today, I think it's very clear that UPL was operating without the required environmental licenses. So I just want to know, is there an internal investigation just within, not just local or maybe national government, of how UPL was actually able to operate this long, and why it had to take, a disaster to actually, reveal the
accompanied by colleagues from health, and I got a very thorough briefing on the epidemiological work that is taking place. So there was initial sampling taking place of the Blackburn community. Once we got the profile of the smoke plume, there is now a plan to sample a much broader community. And the intention is to randomly resample the Blackburn village community, but monitoring. I specifically asked about things like taking an inventory on women who are pregnant, and taking information when babies are born. So I was confident that there is significant health monitoring taking place. I think that what we are all concerned about is that the impact of the smoke may not reflect immediately. And this is why taking monitoring over a longer period of time is so important. and looking at different categories of people, children, expectant women, older people, and so on. So I was satisfied from the discussions which I had with the health practitioners that this matter is being attended to with seriousness, and that over a period of time we will have a significant monitoring exercise which should then give us appropriate data for what we would need to do. Yes, we are monitoring for dioxins. I think what I came to understand in the 4 hours that I spent on the site yesterday is that not only is this the most significant environmental disaster to happen in recent times, but it's also, from a scientific point of view, one of the most complicated. And it's extremely complicated because any one of the chemical compounds on its own, as concentrated compounds, would cause significant damage. I think what we don't know is what happens when these compounds are mixed, burnt, and then find themselves going into the environment. So it's from a scientific point of view, I think the work is very complicated, because once you analyze what is there, you've then got to understand the relevant toxicity. So I think the scientific nature of the endeavor that's being undertaken is actually very complicated. Now, I think this issue you're raising about the independence of information is a really important issue. And I think the issue that is really important is how is information that is being collected by specialists that are being employed by UPL, how are we utilizing it? So the first example that we have is this report that is being done on the beaches. So the beach report says that we can reopen the beaches and we can keep a much smaller exclusion zone, both in terms of the beaches and in terms of the sea. Now, because we are concerned about the independence issue that we are raising, that is why we have sent it to the US for analysis. Because what we want to know is, when an independent party looks at this research, what is the conclusion that they would reach on the safety aspects? So I think that is why we are peer reviewing that report. And because before we came here, as you know, we met with various stakeholders, and obviously there's frustration from the fishermen, from the hotel industry, and so on. If UPL's report says it's safe to open, why can't we go ahead and open? And the answer is because there are concerns in the public domain around the efficacy of that research, and it must be peer reviewed. The real issue is, can we do it quicker and more effectively so that we can have answers, and if it is safe to open, we can facilitate that so the tourism can continue. And I think that is in the understanding of the work we're doing, that is how we will have to handle the independence issue. I think what you've heard from Francis is that this incident has also raised questions about how will we handle these kind of incidents if, God forbid, they happen again. And I think that this is where we're looking at the question of putting together multidisciplinary teams, so that you do have on standby the appropriate scientists who can advise you on matters of this nature. How was UPL able to do this? Well, they did only, unfortunately, operate for 3 months. So it wasn't as if it was years and years. I guess that's what the criminal investigation is looking into. So let's wait for the conclusions of that process. I don't know, you want to add anything? Nothing? Okay, good.
Thanks, Minister. Any further question? Yes?
Derek Albert from Bloomberg. If you can just contextualize, you're talking about the severity of this incident. How severe was it? What can you relate it to? Is anything to relate it to? Because we hear some rather scary stuff. We're talking about all sorts of things overseas that's comparable with. We just want to know what is the feeling? How serious was this?
Well, the estuary is dead. There's nothing living in that estuary anymore. The river is dead. There's nothing living in the river anymore. So one may say, why does that matter? Other than to those who are sort of a bit keen on nature. And the reason it matters is because estuaries and rivers provide very important ecosystem services. So if you have a river and a wetland system and an estuary, you are dealing with water storage, you're dealing with storm runoff, you're dealing with groundwater absorption, and you are dealing with a place where fish can live and breed. And if all of that is dead and there's nothing living in it anymore, the vegetation is dying off, the fish and the crustacea have all died, then obviously those are indicators that that system at this point in time is not able to play its functions. I am not a scientist, so I can't tell you what is this comparable with, but it's pretty awful. And I think that we have to be concerned about it, and we have to be concerned about it because it's not something that happened and that after 73 days all that toxic water has washed away. That sediment is in that system, and it's going to be there for several years. And what we saw yesterday, because we were traipsing around in the pouring rain, is that every time it rains, there's more toxic spill that takes place. So I think that one is not just concerned about the immediate event that happened, but one is concerned about the longer-term implications of that event for the environment in general and for human health. And I've already spoken about the fact that we are worried that even if people had a few coughs and sniffles at the time when the event happened, what did ingesting these things mean for their health in the longer term? And that's why we are going to be taking this random blood and urine sampling and checking babies that are born and so on, so that we can give certainty to the community as to what are the health impact, the longer term health impacts, if there are going to be longer term health impacts. I don't know if you want to comment on that. Yeah.
Thanks, Minister.
As long as my scientists are happy, I'm fine.
Thank you. Any further questions, ladies and gentlemen? I think we've exhausted. Oh, Tony, the last bite.
Thanks. Just one last question. In terms of the attack itself, is there any indication of anyone being arrested or any evidence being available as to who they are?
Tony, at this stage not. What has happened with MKZN is they have consolidated all the unrest dockets into a single kind of unit within the police. And so they have very specific investigating officers working on all the kind of issues. But as far as we've been told, in terms of that particular warehouse and the fire that was started in that warehouse, they have not got any evidence as to, unfortunately, who started it. But they do indicate that there is further work happening, but at this stage, not.
All right. Thanks. No further questions, Minister, Councillor, colleagues, and that's how we come to the end of this briefing. Lunch will be at the Saffron, which is on the 4th floor. We realize that we took you from home on a Sunday, so you are invited to have lunch before you leave. And thank you so much. Thanks, Minister. Thanks, Councillor. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. We've issued the Minister's statement. So if you're on our database, you'll receive it. But if you don't have it yet, Eleanor will make it available to you electronically, either via WhatsApp or whichever way you prefer to receive your statements when you're out of